Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Osamu Tezuka's The Creator. Now, if you're unfamiliar with The Creator, there's a bit of a history here. Back in 2013, a brand new publishing company called Kansai Club Publishing created a Kickstarter to release this title. By all accounts, it seemed quite successful. They had a goal and they went over that goal by a lot. So it seemed like a very successful campaign. However, it became clear very quickly that they were running into trouble actually producing this book. And eventually they just stopped communicating with the backers, and it was assumed that it was cancelled, which understandably frustrated a lot of backers who had invested money in it and had gotten nothing in return. Cut forward several years, and in one of Digital Manga Publishing's Kickstarter campaigns, I believe if I'm correct, it was their Under the Air campaign, they announced that they had gotten the rights to release The Creator. However, they also mentioned the fact that they were not linked to that first campaign, and so they were not obligated to honor the pledges made in that first campaign. So if you wanted this book and you had backed the first campaign, you would have to pledge again in order to get this copy. And understandably, that made a lot of people very bitter, but also began to give this title a bit of a reputation. The struggle to release this in English seemed quite intriguing. I, of course, myself was also quite intrigued by this, and so I was quite eager to read this book. And now that I've read it, that I have this copy, I think it's important that I share my thoughts on what I think of this. So let's get started. So first of all, it's worth noting that this is an anthology series. This is a collection of short stories that all but one were published in Shonen Champion, which is a magazine that Osamu Tezuka would work with quite a bit in the future, particularly on a little known series of his called Blackjack. And that actually surprised me, the fact that this is actually a shonen series, which I was not expecting. All the vibes from it seemed to make me think that it would be a seinen series. But even then, reading the stories, a lot of them are very dark, a lot of them are very trippy, a lot of them seem quite seinen. So it's kind of a case that I would consider it to be kind of in between shonen and seinen in terms of subject matter, in terms of style. However, the important thing, of course, is the stories themselves. And the stories themselves are quite varied. There's a few that are very sci-fi oriented. There's a few that are kind of a bit more set in the past. And most of them are set in kind of modern day. And I say kind of quote-unquote modern day, because I mean modern day when this was released, as in 1969 to 1970. But even more important than the variety of stories is their quality. And that's an area that's actually found a bit problematic. When I began reading this book, the first few stories I really did not care for. And as the book continued, sure, there were actually some really interesting stories that I came across, but on the whole, I actually think that the quality varies so significantly. It actually reminds me of Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy, where there were some amazing stories in Astro Boy, but also a lot of really bad stories. But I have to say that amongst the short story collections that I've read from Osamu Tezuka, I have to say that I think that this is actually amongst his weakest, which I think is a shame, considering the reputation that this manga built up. I found that a little on the disappointing side, but for those of you who are interested in Osamu Tezuka, it's still well worth reading because there are some genuinely good stories in here. It's just the fact that a lot of them are stories that I also did not care for. Now, with regards to the artwork, now as I mentioned before, these stories were released between 1969 and 1970. Now, admittedly, there was one story that was released in 1974, but for the most part, it was released between 1969 and 1970. And the artwork in this series is very reminiscent of that time. It was a time when Osamu Tezuka was introducing more detail and more realism to his art style, but he still hadn't quite completed the change that would be seen in many of his later works in the 70s and particularly the 80s. And so you get this kind of a blend of the cartoony style of his earlier manga, but the kind of more detailed look of his later manga. And I have to say that I do quite like the artwork here. Even though a lot of it doesn't hold a candle to the best artwork that Osamu Tezuka could produce, there's still some very lovely scenes here. The characters themselves are very expressive. There's a lot of charm to their design. The backgrounds are nicely detailed. So overall, the artwork here is quite nice. It isn't amongst Osamu Tezuka's best, but it is still a very pleasant looking manga. Now, with regards to how this was released by Digital Manga Publishing, now there's quite a bit to break it down here. First of all, as you've probably noticed, it's actually quite a thick book. This is well over 500 pages long, so there's a lot of content here. If I compare it to my trusty Yotsuba, you will see that it is the standard size for Digital Manga Publishing Tezuka titles. Now, with regards to the page quality, there is some very sharp contrasts between the whites and the blacks in this book. So that looks very nice. I always like seeing a sharp contrast. However, a bit of a problem that I actually think is in this book is there's a little bit of page bleeding. Not too much, but a little bit more than you see in your standard release from Digital Manga Publishing. And I do wonder, is it to do with the fact that there's so many pages in this? While it isn't terribly distracting, it is worth noting. As is standard in the Digital Manga Publishing short story collections from Osamu Tezuka, there is a page after the last story that tells you which magazines these were published in and the dates on which they were released, which is quite nice information to have. But where this release really stands out is the foreword and afterwards. First of all, the foreword is written by Frederick L. Schott, who is an expert when it comes to Osamu Tezuka, and he gives a lot of very interesting information surrounding this book, as well as the fact that he agrees with me that the level of quality here is quite wide. And something that actually stood out to me was that this foreword was written in 2013, so I do believe that this was written for the Kansai Club Publishing, and he had to make a little modification just to acknowledge that it was in fact Digital Manga Publishing who were releasing this book. So I thought that was quite interesting. There was an afterword from Osamu Tezuka himself, which is always nice to see. I always enjoy being able to see what Osamu Tezuka himself thought of these stories that he wrote. But we also get a very long afterword from Ada Palmer detailing a lot of the themes that we read throughout this book, and it's quite an interesting read. And in fact, this one did seem to be written in 2017, so I do believe that Digital Manga Publishing actually did ask her to contribute to this book, which is quite nice. So those are some very nice extras. So overall, what are my thoughts on The Crater? It is a very interesting read. There's some very good stories in here, but there's a lot of stories that I didn't care for. And as I said before, I actually do think that of all the short story collections that I've been reading from Osamu Tezuka, this is amongst his weakest, which I think is a shame given the reputation that actually developed around this title. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not worth reading. If you're an Osamu Tezuka fan, there's still enough good stories in here that it is worth seeking out. And it's also worth owning because of the historical value it had. These stories, these short stories, were actually amongst the first released in Shonen Champion. So it's quite an important work in the legacy of Osamu Tezuka. There's a lot of great extras here, as I mentioned before, and the page quality itself is pretty good. Even though the page bleeding's there, it's still pretty good overall. This is a pretty good release of it, and so I do think that if you're an Osamu Tezuka fan, this is still worth picking up. It's just a case that this is probably a situation where the quality of the book itself doesn't quite match the reputation and intrigue that developed over the years for it. So that was my thoughts on The Crater from Osamu Tezuka. If you have had any experience with The Crater, whether through the Kickstarter campaigns or if you've actually picked up and read this book, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.